Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's program, which is a student roundtable about the future of museums. We want to begin by acknowledging that the Weisman Art Museum is located on the traditional and contemporary land of the Dakota people. We aspire to honor and respect the Indigenous peoples past, present, and future by incorporating Indigenous knowledge in our work and establishing meaningful reciprocal relationships with the carriers of Indigenous knowledge and with communities. My name is Laura Polarski, and I am the Programs and Education Assistant here at the Weisman Art Museum. I'm also a first-year graduate student in the Arts and Cultural Leadership program. And today we'll hear from 3 student groups from university museums: the WAM Collective from the Weisman Art Museum at the University of Minnesota, the Student Advisory Council from the Tang Museum at Skidmore College, and the Agents for Creative Action from the Williams College Museum of Art. Each group will give us a 10-minute presentation of their vision within their institutions and what changes they think are necessary to the field. The event will culminate with a discussion and Q&A between our student groups, comparing their findings, critiques, and hopes for the future of museums. This event is an exciting intellectual exercise from the student perspective. We're not approaching this discussion as experts in our field, but rather as a dialogue between us. We certainly don't have all the answers, but we would love to think alongside you this evening. Before we begin, I would like to thank the voters of Minnesota for supporting the operational budget of our museum through the funds of the Minnesota State Arts Board. And also thank you to the Wells Fargo Foundation of Minnesota for supporting the operational budget as well. And I'm so grateful to my colleagues at the Weisman Art Museum for helping make this event happen this evening. Before we get started, just some housekeeping things. As we begin our conversation, we invite you to submit your questions and thoughts through the Q&A feature. It'll be at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll respond to your questions in the Q&A period after the presentation portion. You may also upvote the questions you're interested in by clicking the like button, and questions with more votes will rise to the top of the queue. We'll also be recording today's event, and it will be posted to the Weisman's YouTube channel, in addition to a written summary that will be featured on our Weisman Art Museum blog in the near future, so look for that. Also, make sure to turn on live captioning. You can select that as visible by selecting Show Subtitles in the drop-down menu under the Live Transcription tab at the bottom of your screen. All right, and to get us started, I would like to welcome the WAM Collective. Okay, great. So the mission of the WAM Collective at the Weisman Art Museum is to serve as the student voice of the museum. We want to act as a bridge between the widely diverse student body of the university and with WAM. The collective fosters student ownership of the museum. We advise staff on effective ways to engage the student body, and we're proactive in promoting WAM throughout the university community and beyond. This manifests through programming, as you'll see here, content creation, and engagement with the local arts community. So welcome to the WAM Collective.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lauren Armani. I'm a student officer of WAM Collective, the student group of the Weisman Art Museum. WAM Collective is a cohort of 6 undergraduate students from diverse fields of study, including art history, psychology, museology, women, gender, sexuality, cinema, media studies, journalism, anthropology, strategic communications, and design. While the last year has been unlike any other, we have been working alongside museum staff on programs and strategies that engage the student body of the University of Minnesota with the Weisman, while also studying larger trends in the field. COVID-19 has disrupted almost everything in our lives, and the museum field has not been immune. From the urgent call to diversify museum staffs to the increased scrutiny over museum collections, we feel that museums are at a flashpoint, and as undergraduate students, we are often left out of this conversation. We're so glad to be in this roundtable with our peers from Skidmore and Williams College to discuss, analyze, critique, and muse on the future of museums from our perspective as Gen Z undergraduates from diverse majors and student advisory board members at university art museums. To begin, let's take a look at the foundational idea of what a museum is.
Hi. So art museums have colonial Western patriarchal roots. There has been recent debate on the definition of a museum. Museums used to be defined as a collection of objects for exchange of knowledge and culture and history. There is a lot of debate of what the new definition of a museum should be, but many people say it is a place to fight against and inform the public about social injustice or problems we see in the world, as well as a place to promote equality, justice, and the planet's well-being. Instead of describing museums as strictly educational or historical, we hope to look towards a future where museums are a dynamic space for self-reflection, personal growth, and community engagement. While debating what should and should not be included in this definition, the WAM Collective was tasked with coming up with our own definition, which was flexible and fluid. We decided it should be somewhere to display dynamic and diverse forms of art, relay knowledge about cultural or historical information, be inclusive to all types of people across differences of race, sexuality, class, and age, and also fulfill and articulate a social responsibility. Beyond just the display of art, we believe museums should host art activities that invite physical exchange, that are physically and intellectually accessible, and should be affordable or free of charge. With this in mind, our definition did not necessarily require a collection, but rather focused on the interaction between community, the self, and art. Whether that art is held in perpetuity by an institution was less important to us.
Yeah, so as Özge said, museums as institutions are implicated in the long history of European colonial plunder. The most salient example of the imperialist history of museums is the Benin Bronzes, the metal plaques and sculpture that formerly decorated the royal palace in the Kingdom of Benin, which is present-day Nigeria. The objects were stolen by the British in the 19th century and disseminated to a number of European museums. Although some museums have agreed to return some of the objects, the British Museum, which holds over 900 of them, will not. The museum does acknowledge that the objects were looted, but in order to fully decolonize museums, such gestures of recognition cannot suffice. But what does it really mean to decolonize a museum? Can museums truly be decolonized? Audre Lorde writes, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, and museums are organizations that operate through colonial systems that order and name and number and categorize. It's hard to believe that such a big ship can be turned at the speed necessary." It's also important to mention that even museums not directly connected to colonial plundering often have objects in their collections which have morally tainted histories. Our own museum has been working to face the legacy of colonialism and white supremacy in our collections, and is moving towards the repatriation of Mimbres cultural materials that were excavated by the university in the mid-30s. Another thing we need to work on moving forward is redefining what the role of a curator in a museum is. The word curator comes from the Latin root cura or curare, meaning to care. A curator, then, is someone who cares for the collection of a museum, if it has one. In a broader sense, a curator is someone who organizes the activities of a museum which pertain to its collection or stated goals. Often, the curatorial department is thought of as the intellectual center of meaning-making in museums. They select the objects and craft the narratives for the public to consume. However, like museums on a larger scale, curatorial departments are usually hierarchically organized, meaning that even if multiple curators object to certain decisions about what information or how information should be presented to museum goers, one person at the top of the department can ignore the concerns of others. This is especially problematic in light of the 2018 Mellon Foundation report, which found that 84% of curators are white. Like the debated ICOM definition for museums, we believe that the future of museums must be polyphonic or multi-voiced. But in order to do that, museums must not only create new access points for other ways of knowing to be legitimized, but attitudes in the field need to change around what forms of knowledge are supported in museum spaces. Specifically, this means questioning what expertise means and not privileging the Western academic mode in which curators usually operate.
However, in order to do any of these things, financial resources are needed. WAM, like many other university museums, is a 501c3 nonprofit and a non-academic unit within the University of Minnesota. Unlike a public museum that reports directly to a fiduciary or governing board, the Weisman has a reporting relationship to the University of Minnesota's Board of Regents, the president of the university, the senior vice president and provost, the director and chief curator of Wham, and the directors that have power over various departments. Within this large ecosystem, there are many exchanges of resources from both government and non-government entities, private and public sources. And attached to many of those sources are restrictions, meaning that money is earmarked to carry out specific outcomes as prescribed by the funder. The US nonprofit sector today accounts for more than $1 trillion in annual economic activity, making it on its own one of the world's largest economies. To this end, we spent some time this semester reading and learning more about what has been referred to as the nonprofit industrial complex. It's described in the anthology, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, as a set of symbiotic relationships that link political and financial technologies of state and owning class control with surveillance over public political ideology, including and especially emergent progressive and leftist social movements. It has been argued that this is how the state uses nonprofits to monitor and control social justice movements, divert money from public hands to private through foundations, mask exploitation through philanthropy, and encourage organizations to pursue capitalist models. We are not saying that nonprofits or museums are evil, or that there is some wider coordinated agenda happening. We believe that as cultural and educational institutions, museums have the resources and responsibility to play an important part in political movements and social movements. As Latanya Autry and Mike Morawski write, museums are not neutral, and they never have been. This brings me to Emergent Strategy, as described by changemaker Adrienne Marie Brown. Brown's work is inspired by Octavia Butler's explorations of our human relationship to change. Emergent Strategy is radical self-help, society help, and planet help, designed to shape the futures we want to live. Emergent Strategy is an adaptive relational leadership model and practice that teaches us ways of being in relation with home and each other. It's based on the idea of fractals, that what happens on a small scale is replicated on a bigger scale. So how can we transform museums into ecosystems where everyday connections and interactions matter? One answer is biomimicry, or the imitation of nature. Many align with the capitalistic belief that constant growth in critical mass is the only way to create change. But if we think on a small-scale grassroots level, we can plant seeds today that slowly grow and transform into something nourishing, resilient, and revolutionary. And we can create a place that is a decentralized, democratized place of love and community.
As a result of museum closures, financial losses, and many other detrimental effects of COVID-19, museums have been forced to address defining factors of their existence. For a long time, museums have simply just existed, but events over the past year have made it clear that it's time for museums to either adapt to society's needs and emerge with new strategies, or cease to exist. The first change that is being made is rethinking the definition of what a museum is. This definition should go beyond a collective of objects held at an institution to serve communities, but should address society's needs. The International Council of Museums attempted to decide on a new definition in 2019, but their search was inconclusive. At the root of this issue, we believe, are museums' relationships with their audiences. For a long time, they were thought to serve an exclusive intellectual group, but have been shifting their focus to be more inviting and welcoming to a broader audience. This pairs with the need of museums to be more accessible in more ways than one. Not only should the attitude museums give off be welcoming to all, the physical spaces, exhibits, and experiences they provide should be accessible to all community members they seek to be in relationships with. If museums want to continue to exist, they must strive to be relevant, and to do that, they must confront the racial injustice and colonialism woven into their structure and foundation. This means addressing prior wrongdoings and seeking accountability and reconciliation, rethinking the artifacts they possess and the ways in which they present them, questioning if the voices of their staff reflect those of the community they serve, as well as the hierarchies perpetuated through museums' power structures and finances. Finally, museums must prove to society that their existence is essential. Many people view museums as disposable. There's an assumption and association with museums that they are spaces made for a select audience. We must find a way to make it so that individuals don't feel like museums are trying to lecture or make them feel lesser. Thinking about these changes that need to be made as a group, we have explored our dream innovative art spaces and what they might look like. Some of our collective conditions were as follows. Museums of the future should not feel exclusive. They may look nothing like a conventional museum, and they should be spaces where noise and discussion are comfortable and welcome. We've worked in pairs to discuss what our dream art spaces might look like and came up with ideas such as the Dinky Town Open Air Museum, a tour around Dinky Town, for those of you who don't know, is a small downtown district near our campus that marks historical landmarks and engages with current political and social movements happening in the city, paired with artistic and socially engaged responses. We imagine the space to be a porous, non-physical space, meaning that community members can engage with these intersecting sectors without having to go into a building. And this taps into and it works alongside energy-specific spaces. What kind of conversations and solutions could happen if we were to bring campus street culture, city leaders, graffiti artists, or working moms into the dialogue? This type of socially engaged museum practice is one that has been building at WAM through the Target Studio for Creative Collaboration, and we wonder what an entire museum like this might look like. We see another example of this in the Wanawari in Seattle, Washington. Described as an immersive community art project that reclaims Black cultural space and makes a statement about the importance of Black land ownership in gentrified communities, Wanawari is located in a fifth-generation Black-owned home and is one example of an innovative art space that we believe museums could borrow from in light of the long history of community extraction within the museum sector. What would it look like if a museum platformed an entire community within their space? With these examples, there are several questions we must ask ourselves. In the conversation of museums of the future, can anything be considered a museum? Without proper guidelines, does the definition itself lose meaning? And if so, should it?
And so in thinking about these innovative spaces, we also want to highlight accessibility. As a foundational idea, we're thinking of disability in general using the social model. So the medical model states that disability is a deficit in the body, whereas the social model highlights that barriers are put on those with disabilities in a social context. So we want to work on removing those barriers in the museum space. In order to do this, a lot of things have to be done. We want to see disability considered at every step of the way in a museum process, instead of just being the responsibility of the education department, which is currently how it stands in most places. Instead, we want to see it be considered by curations, programs, education, comm teams, the whole thing. And as a part of this, we want to do more than just meet guidelines set by organizations like the ADA. We want to think about disability as a methodology to cultivate these new spaces that are accessible and able to be experienced by everyone, regardless of disability. The Weisman is beginning this work through an IMLS grant to create new guidelines and standards alongside an access advisory committee. And we hope to see this work grow and expand and uproot many of the practices that have been in place. This is just the new beginnings in thinking beyond just able bodies as the default and imagining a new future in the museum.
Looking at other changes that need to be made for the Museum of the Future, we believe more Black, Indigenous, and POC women should be staffed in leadership roles where they will have the space to make decisions that positively impact the museum and the community. On top of that, more artworks made by BIPOC women should be included into collections and showcased in exhibits. The goal of ours is to flip the concept of what a museum has to be and who it is for. Some ideas are encouraging exhibit development and storytelling by community members through paid guest curatorships, hosting conversations and events with community members outside of the museum's physical space, and creating spaces for hands-on exchange within the museum. We believe that even art museums don't need to be exclusively hands-on or precious. We would love to see a museum become less sterile and more human-centered. This could include adding more phone chargers and plugins, more spaces to lounge and relax and meet friends and colleagues, places to nurse babies, to move your body, or to kneel down for prayer. And if there is one thing that COVID has taught us, it is the power of technology. We know that museums have been talking about technology for a long time, but the pandemic has really forced the issue home. We are interested in seeing how these hybrid models of museum programming and digital display can be integrated in immersive exhibits to harness the power of collective storytelling.
This last year has taught us a lot about resilience, and we believe that museums have the opportunity right now to make themselves, to move beyond the performative and into policy level, equity-based action. So we believe that the Museum of the Future is self-reflexive, meaning that it owns its past mistakes and works towards healing broken or fractured relationships. We believed it is networked and porous, meaning that it creates and connects and it amplifies. This can be considered for both internal and external relationships and hierarchies. We believe that it is human, meaning that it centers and honors human relationships and works in service to those needs across difference of race, sexuality, class, and age. Beyond fulfilling the mission of the organization, we believe that museums have a social responsibility and that they must articulate that. We believe that the museum in the future is fluid. They're always changing because people and social structures are always changing. Why do we need one definition of museum? New words and meanings are created every day. And the pandemic has especially taught us that new ways of working and being together can change too. Museums should embrace the idea that the only constant is change and should stop resisting it. Thank you. Also, we have some sources that'll be up and they're also in the chat for y'all to check out. Next up, we have the Student Advisory Council from the Tang Teaching Museum.
All right, great. Thanks so much for the introduction. My name is Evan Little and I'm here with Maria and we're from the Tang and are excited to be here talking about the future of museums.
Hi, I'm Maria Stack. I'm a junior at Skidmore and I am a member of the Tang Student Advisory Council, and I'm also the Meg Reitman Jacobs intern this year at the Tang, so I work in public programming.
My name is Evan Little. I'm a junior at Skidmore College, also on the Student Advisory Council and the Charina Endowment Fund intern in the Department of Collections and Curation at the museum. So to give you a bit of a background of who we are as Skidmore and as the Tang. So Skidmore is a community that is made up of about 2,500 people, 2,500 undergraduate students, and we're located in Saratoga Springs, New York. And the Tang's primary purpose is as a teaching institution for direct education use. So the museum's mission focuses on ideas and the regular use of the museum galleries and collection storage spaces as teaching spaces. And it follows the principles that artwork can and should be used to advance the knowledge across the disciplines. And we do not display any type of permanent collection in our space. So all of our spaces are constantly shifting with exhibitions a few times a year. And the museum's collection is primarily contemporary art objects. And we're coming to the conference today by way of the Student Advisory Council, which is a group of about 50 students on campus that interact with museum staff and other students to increase engagement with the museum. So as members of the Student Advisory Council, we plan events for engagement, such as the image you can see at the top left of your screen, called 8 Tables, a crafting and art making event that the museum holds in the atrium. To the right of that is the Tang Party, which is an annual spring event, which actually happened last weekend, COVID safe, and students show art on the walls and grounds surrounding the museum. And then below that, we have an image of the Tang Pop-Up, which is a student-run sale of student-made art and art objects that's held within the museum space. And next, we also plan and run initiatives such as Day Without Art for the campus community to participate in. And we also, as a museum, have a wide range of internships and employment opportunities that enhance student interaction with the museum and the staff, which is truly an integral part of the way that we create exhibitions and plan programming. So now for what we're here to talk to you all about. And as students who believe in the transformative power of art and wish to see our institutions grow in their efforts to directly engage in the necessary process of social change and transformation, Maria and I are going to present 2 different ideas to you today. The first being that museums strive to be places where information is shared freely and openly, and museums must prioritize this access. And access comes in many forms, but the one which, as students at the Tang, want to prioritize is access to the full searchability of our collections. So museums can often be perceived as gatekeepers of knowledge, information, and images. But for what reasons? And how can we as institutions contribute to the growing study of contemporary art? How do we expand reach beyond our own gallery walls? And I think one way in which this can be done is by prioritizing and starting conversations on what a world with open access might look like. What benefits does more collection access bring? And how can we prioritize cataloging efforts to increase awareness of collections items? And if COVID has taught us anything, it's that the digital world and its environments are here to stay. So for me, following recent conversations have really led me to realize that the 15,000 objects in our collection as the Tang need to be more fully accessible to our students and the wider community. So databases are easily turned into stagnant spaces. And we're interested in how we can create more connections across archives and collections within our peer institutions. So how can we encourage greater exploration? And we think that programs such as Art Store, a media repository utilized by museums, archives, and artists alike, provide a platform for fuller exchanges of artworks and deeper connections to be drawn across archives. They move objects out of isolation and into larger repositories for understanding and making connections, which should be a part of our collective future. So exploring systems for digital collection sharing will allow for deeper use and interaction of all of our collections. So the future of museums are a time where digital access and creation of digital exhibitions are normal, where access to images and information on objects are shared widely, and where exchange is celebrated and connections are easier to make. So as we move into the discussion section in a few moments, I'm interested to see how your institutions present their collections online with varying levels of access.
Hi, so now I'll be proposing our idea that museums should look deeper into cataloging the identities of artists. As the Jacobs intern at the Tang, I have to create a capstone project, and for the past 2 semesters, I have been working on an exhibition that will be up in the fall, and my interest is greatly tied to Black abstract art. So last semester, when I asked for abstract leaning works by Black artists in the Tang's collection, I was given a pretty sparse list that was created from the memories of Tang staff, essentially. And if we had cataloged artists' identities, I'm certain this list would have been much longer. And then taking these 2 images as examples of works by Black artists. On the left, we have a work which prominently features a Black body, and then on the right, a work which does not feature a Black body. Taking the image on the left as one example of a work by Kara Walker, and her work typically features images of Black bodies. She has been frequently exhibited at the Tang, and as she should be, because her work is very important in the history of Black art and art history in general. But I think that we also do have to be careful that we are allowing room for new and other Black artists and ideas in museums. And then in comparison, the work on the right by William Villalongo, which does not feature a Black body, this work has rarely, if ever, been presented for exhibition and view at the Tang. But luckily, when I asked for abstract works by Black artists, this piece, Funky Space Reincarnation, was among those recalled by the Tang staff. However, it haunts me to wonder how many abstract works by Black artists go unrecognized or forgotten in the Tang's collection and the collections of other museums that similarly do not catalog using artists' identities. If we were to catalog artists' identities, museums can begin to display a wider range of art by underrepresented groups because their identities will not necessarily have to be so blatantly represented in the visuals of the artwork. And then looking at this topic from a statistical standpoint, a study published in 2019 by Williams College professors titled Diversity of Artists in Major US Museums analyzed the collections of 18 major US institutions. The results indicated that about 1.2% of these collections were made up of works by Black artists, 2.8% by Hispanic or Latinx artists, 9% by Asian artists, and about 85.4% by white artists, and the rest other or unknown. With the knowledge gained from tracking these artists' identities in the collections, we have a much better grasp of the failings of art institutions and can then move forward with an effort towards fuller and more diverse collections. I would also like to be mindful that race is only one of many underrepresented identities in museums. And then, of course, there are certain ethical shortcomings of cataloging artists' identities, as we don't want to place identities onto individuals, in which case they would have to agree to self-identify. But at least this would be better than having no identification at all. And a project like this might include sending surveys to living artists so that they could choose how they would like to be represented. That being said, we do feel that the Tang is very successful in many areas, especially the involvement of students. We find that students are often interested in issues at the forefront of our culture, making for thought-provoking and successful projects. The images here are from a recent exhibition in the Hyde Cabinet, which is a student-curated space at the Tang, which typically can hold one art object. These images, so in this image, Malkaija Hoskins, who's from the class of 22, chose to display his do-rag, which is an object not typically seen on the walls of a museum, so that made for really interesting conversations. And then here's another example of student-curated work. These images are from the exhibition When and Where I Enter, which was curated by an American Studies class called Critical Whiteness. Through art, students examined positionalities of people identifying with different racial groups. And in looking at these two exhibitions, we believe that students are the future of the museum and have really incredible ideas to share. Thank you for listening to our presentation. Williams College will be presenting next.
Hi, everybody. Can everyone hear me? I'm hoping. Hoping yes. Okay. Hi, my name is Chris. I am a grad student in the history of art at Williams College. Oh, thank you. You can hear and see the presentation. Excellent. And I am one of the advisors of our wonderful student group, Agents for Creative Action. I'm just going to briefly introduce who we are and then turn it over to our awesome student participants. So to briefly introduce the group, Agents for Creative Action, or ACA, is a group of around 20 undergrads, 1 art history graduate student, and 2 museum staff members at the Williams College Museum of Art that reframes museum practice as a creative process. Together, we animate the museum's collections, exhibitions, and spaces through the development of original projects and programs, and we contribute to museum-wide initiatives that seek to elevate the museum as a dynamic and welcoming space for creative thought, community building, and intellectual development in the eyes of both Williams students and community stakeholders. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Kaylin, who will start us off.
Hey everyone, I'm Kaylin. I don't know if you can see me, but that's okay. I'm a member of ACA. I go to Williams College. And for the beginning of our presentation, we're going to be talking about enduring and changing roles of museums. And I thought it was really interesting as I was looking through graphics of what like museum clip art is. There was always this sort of like image of a museum with pillars in the front. And I think that speaks to the points that the Wham group was bringing up earlier about how museums are stereotypically seen as like pillars and like institutions, like temples of whiteness, upholding colonial beliefs and practices of exoticizing and extracting culture from people. So yeah, the way we conceptualized as like the historical view of museums is a place to store stolen and looted artifacts. Though we want to recognize that museums such as WICMA are going through the process of de-accessioning and repatriation, often through the NAGPRA. And last summer, I was an intern working on de-accessioning, and there are so many objects that are just not shown that museums have to accept. And that speaks to the point of how museums are functioning and still to this day function as asset hoarders, where wealthy people are able to use them for tax write-offs and to launder wealth. And so much of a museum's collection is always stuck in the archives, and a very small percentage of it is ever even shown. Museums also function as keepers of history and knowledge, though the way that the objects are portrayed, the context that they're chosen to be portrayed, typically only show very specific narratives. And they establish value systems for the objects that are portrayed in museums, sometimes elevating what might be in a museum's collection over other cultural artifacts and objects. Obviously, museums do the work of preserving art objects physically, but they also preserve colonial white-centric narratives of viewing art and how we conceptualize the other and diverse cultures. Museums are also cultural caretakers through preserving and storing art and displaying different cultures and keeping them alive through education, outreach, history, etc., but to varying degrees. We hope a lot of museums now are working on questioning the art historical canon in regards to what sort of cultures, histories, and aesthetics are prioritized, and taking those into consideration in how they are interpreting and preserving the past for a wide audience of viewers. The education and entertainment aspects are very important, but as has been discussed previously by the WAM group, with varying degrees of accessibility for the communities in which the museums reside. We're looking for new ways of telling old stories, or really working within communities to create space for new stories to have a platform. And museums, especially the one at WICMA, that are tied to colleges and universities, are sites of education and this sort of institutional critique, historical criticism, and just spaces for art exploration. For example, the fact that we have a student art group, or how WICMA hosts the senior studio art show, and having curatorial interns that have direct input into the goings on of the museum, and yeah, that can materially be seen in the products. So I think now I will pass off to either Ethan or Victoria.
Hi everyone, I'm Victoria. I'm a senior at Williams, and I'll be talking to the museum's institutional structure and philosophy. So really what we're thinking about is kind of the moral and ethics behind the entire museum's kind of process and operations. So some of the things that we really discussed heavily are the museum's own openness to change, you know, for how experimental a museum can be in terms of the different exhibitions we can put on in the different events. Openness to change and like changing the process and perhaps changing authority is actually, you know, a very interesting and heavily variable undergoing. And then another line item to cover is just that, you know, museums are powerful spaces. They have a lot of influence in terms of culture on the community in terms of outreach as well. And it is, part of the forefront of the industry as a whole. And so, inventory is really what we argue to be the source of that power. And part of the process is actually to, revisit ethics of a museum, reconsider redistributing assets like earlier speakers have actually talked about. And then also just influence, what does it look like if power were actually flat instead of hierarchical, however, as appropriate. And so, when Kaylin touched about how the museums can be asset hoarders, we maybe want to consider how museums can actually be a collection of objects to support community programming or to support community engagement, and use art as a way to really anchor our community and programming and residents and, the local, the local environment and ecosystem. So I think what our end goal is really about telling how museum structure can actually be inherently supportive of new and untold stories rather than just holding objects. And so from a collection of objects and cultural properties, we can become a collection of community connections. And I think another aspect that we can talk to is finances, which Ethan will come take over. If Ethan's here. No. Okay, I can touch on finances. So finances super quickly, I think everyone kind of understands mainly the finances behind the museum.
Victoria, oh, Ethan is here. So
oh, he is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So hi, I'm Ethan. I am a first year student at Williams College, and this basically has a lot to do with what Kaylin was just saying about transparency and finances. But basically, we think museums should turn more to repatriation and reparations, as well as reallocating and appropriating funds to support creative development in the community, as well as working towards equitable pay and worker support for employees.
Right, and so going back to the democratization and accessibility and transparency topics, I know everyone has touched upon this in some kind of format, but the whole point of having this and addressing it is really thinking about how everyone can be both heard and understood. Like, how can everyone's thoughts and collective perspective be digestible for others and, be like comprehensible, not just have someone's ear to listen, but to have someone's understanding. And we think part of that might just be giving students more power, giving the community more power, making the acquisitions more transparent. I actually had the fortunate opportunity to take part of a course that allowed students to pitch artworks to the museum for the permanent collection. And, that was a really interesting process, thinking about the museum's own kind of collection history and collection portfolio. And, I think this process helps make the museums more nimble and capable of response, because students, our community, tend to be a little bit more reactive than the internal spaces and like very institutional structures that a museum typically abides and follows. And another kind of facet that we discussed was working directly with the public on cultural heritage issues. An example of this is the Guardian Benin Bronzes project, also repatriation. So uniform policies and collaboration across different countries and museums. This would be a huge effort, but we think that's definitely something to consider in the back of our minds, like how does unification actually work? And then overall, just making sure communications is, streamlined, right? Like communications are going through a diverse range of people. They're coming from a diverse range of people. And even social media to get to an even more diverse group of people. And then having an institutional kind of level of permanence to how we make this part of a digital museum experience.
Hey, yeah, so for there's two parts to, I'm just going to be talking about like the museum space. So there's two parts of this, and essentially this centering around the idea that we should be shifting museums to be a place designed for people and for human experience and not just the actual art. So this starts with being more accessible, not only physically, but metaphorically, and how attending museums and the culture surrounding museum practice feels like a privilege when in reality it should be like a casual experience open to everybody. And part of this is due to the hyper aestheticization of museums and how museums are overwhelmingly white spaces, racially and spatially, that often for people of color or those not familiarized with like what a museum is supposed to be like and how to act in one, museums feel too sanitary, like you can't touch anything or comfortably inhabit your own body in the space. And even if we make all museums free and like they are accessible, this question of social, relational, and bodily comfort still remains, and there is work to be done to dismantle the whiteness sewn into museum culture and rebuild the idea of who a museum is really, who museums really belong to, and by serving underrepresented and marginalized communities in the real world is how we like start to kind of transfer the power dynamic. And this leads to the other part of giving the public a sense of ownership over the space. So this has to do with like making the museum a place to hang out and hold community gatherings. Reviewing art is not the only important service offered. And like the history of museums goes back to how it originally was a space for community and for experience with the art as just like a backdrop. And so I think shifting back to that atmosphere of really just making a space for community and connection can additionally transfer like who museums belong to. And this could do like inviting artists and the public to use the space for making art or centered around artistic creation, holding workshops, learning events, educational events, free Wi-Fi, maybe a cafe, some project spaces, some couches, just making a space where you can touch, interact with the art, and like reimagining the space entirely. So like, for example, in a lot of museums, like art are on pedestals, but like, what if the art was just like on the floor? Or what if these spaces were less empty and the interiors were less polished? What if there was large pops of color? And like, what if we in interspersed community spaces with galleries and had transparency of offices and administration? And so ultimately, these are just ways of in which like the space itself of museums can change and how we can take steps towards real accessibility and what that really means. Thank you.
Okay, my phone started ringing, but we're gonna power through. So as a final touch point, just going off of what Ethan mentioned earlier about the space being reciprocated for our community, I think we'd really like to revisit, some unfinished thoughts regarding how museum is a filter and promoter of culture. That's a really big influence on our local community, and the impacts regarding that are, potentially quite severe and or quite influential. And I think one of our final points is how museums can be more trusting of passion. So what does that actually mean? Like, how often do we let other museum components win over, trusting an artist's passion, trusting the community's passion, or trusting student audience engagement's passion? That's something that I think we should really deeply reconsider and also just mull over. I think it's a body of thought that we don't always touch upon. And so just to cap us all off, I think we'll leave us with the thought that, museums have the incredible opportunity to trust passion. There's so much access. There's a lot of just, tangible changes and actions that can be taken. And so how do we trust passion, be it from our staff, our audience, and our artists? Thank you so much. We're happy to address the Q&A in our chat as well.
Awesome, yay, virtual or real round of applause to everyone. That was so much fun to see what you all have put together and how our visions overlap in some areas and how they differ and what we're doing to kind of get that future started and on the way. Just a reminder, if you want to ask any questions about any of the topics covered here, anything that we didn't cover, feel free to contribute to our conversation in the Q&A box, and feel free to upvote the questions that you really want to hear answered. Just to get us started here, just a question for everyone, and panelists, feel free to turn on your video so that we can see you all as well. We're all coming from this from a student perspective, right? So we're, at the beginning we stated, we're not experts. We don't know, we don't have doctorates in art history or anything of the sort, but we're talking about these subjects, and these subjects come with a lot of, feeling, a lot of importance. Did you feel like you had to hold back or, not talk about certain things that you didn't feel comfortable talking about or didn't feel like you knew enough about? How did you approach this project?
I guess I can go ahead and start. I think with the folks from Wham, at least, we really used not being expert as both like we kept it in mind. It certainly was something we thought about, but also it was something of a blank slate. We could learn about these things just as they were. And we really worked hard on, we kind of initially brainstormed these ideas that we all were already thinking about just in our own lives. And then from there, really, went in and did the research. And, obviously we're not experts, we are undergrads, but this is something that we're passionate about. And I think particularly with the future of museums in mind, we can kind of be open to new ideas. We aren't necessarily, and not to like kind of insult anyone in the museum space, but like we're not as jaded by ideas that are kind of seen as a given. Instead, they're kind of walls that we can break down.
Awesome. Kind of related to that question, how do you feel about expertise when it comes to, qualifications for being a curator and like the academic notion of expertise versus, passion and ability? And do you feel like those qualifications are necessary? I feel like with time, they've kind of meant less and less as time has gone on. So what do you all think about that?
Yeah, I think the idea of like prioritizing what is learned in like a strictly like educational school context is really strange when people have like real lived knowledge, like things that they've done with their body, like real world experience. So while I agree that like knowing things, especially like canonical things, could be really useful, I think people really need to question what modes of knowing we're prioritizing and having authority in these spaces. And I think that just really reaches back to like the like colonial paternalistic view of like who is presenting this cultural knowledge. So yeah, that's my opinion on that.
Yeah, I think also, if the node of contact for museums is either their collection, well, both their collection, if they have one, and the audience they're serving, that's the knowledge that counts. And it's not, how much do you remember about the Sistine Chapel? It should be centered on what are the objects in our museum's collection and who are the people that we're trying to reach.
Yeah, I agree. I also, just speaking from personal experience at the Tang, I think, as I was saying in our presentation, there really is this trust that's given to students. And we're just, well, we don't curate exhibitions entirely on our own. We definitely do get a lot of help from the curators at the museum, but we are given a lot of freedom to kind of explore our own ideas. And I think that's really, really valuable, because then a lot of the exhibitions come out of this place of wanting to be creative and share all of these different experiences that the students have had, but then also getting to learn from the wisdom of the curators and how they kind of go about curating shows in a way where they've been trained. So I think that there's this really cool and unique collaboration that happens there that always results in really interesting and thought-provoking exhibitions.
Kind of related to that question, as university museums, how have you felt about the process of not only serving the student body community, but also serving just your local regional community? Have you found that there's a balance that has to be struck? What's your experience been in that?
I think for us personally at WICMA, because Williamstown does end up being a relatively sparse location, I have found like the demographics of the town actually contrast quite sharply to like our actual school undergrad population. So I think that we have had to like draw a balance between, oh, this is really a program maybe more to accommodate students versus how this is an intersectional program where we're looking to, engage both our community and undergrad. That's what I found.
I think for the Tang, like COVID has been the first time where as students, we haven't seen the museum space filled with people. So it's shown it's only open to our campus communities. So COVID has definitely shown us like what community interaction looks like and what a museum looks like when that community interaction isn't there. And it looks a lot less crowded. It looks a lot less exciting too. I think that's something that's so special about university museums is that we do have that overlap and crossover with the community and visitors and then the student body too. Yeah.
Yeah, that must be such a drastic turn to go from, having mostly outside visitors versus students. It's a really sharp turn in audience. Okay, so we have a question from Megan C. Beyond urgent repatriation efforts, how does de-accessioning collection objects fit into your vision for the museum of the future?
I guess speaking from my experience of being an intern at WICMA, de-accessioning is often used as a means of like getting rid of items in the collection that are like too damaged to be able to take care of further, or ones that are just never put on display. And those funds are really used to the funds from the de-accessioning are really used to purchase more works that align with the museum's goal. And recently WICMA underwent like a vision change in prioritizing different groups of artists. So like Indigenous people, BIPOC, Mexican American people, Asian American people. And I think that's where de-accessioning is really important and sort of like diverting where the focus has been in the past towards looking towards the future. Like in doing de-accessioning paperwork, there were like so many like 17th century British portraits, like way too many for one place to have. Like, who are these random British people that we're representing here? I don't know of them. But it's just good to know that those funds are being used to purchase works from artists that more represent the people who actually go to this school and potentially the people in the broader community. So, yeah.
Yeah, to kind of go off of that as well, I think all of our groups kind of touched on curation as caring for the objects or for the art, whether or not you have them. And I feel like de-accessioning can also be a tool for that, because if there's a piece that you have locked in storage that you as a curator cannot care for and don't have that power, it should go to someone who does. It should go to someone who has ties to the piece, who can care for it, who knows the piece, and not just like a listing off facts kind of way. And so both de-accessioning kind of gives you room to add pieces that you can care for, but it also lets those pieces that are being quote unquote given up be cared for as they kind of deserve to be.
We also had some questions on what art is worth preserving, what role institutions have with preserving art, with the things in their collections, and how that relates to how they're whose stories they're displaying. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've kind of talked about, do museums need collections? And I think the answer is no, but that doesn't mean no one should, hold on to material culture so we can write history. But I think, as just to echo what everyone else has been saying, it's really about whose history are we making the center right now, and how can we democratize the historical narratives that we're writing as institutions. And I think I liked what someone said earlier about, museums being filters, and, because all of our history has to be filtered. But I think the way that we can democratize history and art history is to get more people's perspectives, so our filter is not monolithic. And so that means, as other people have been saying, it means de-accessioning objects that have been historically valued, but maybe they don't align with the value, with the goals of our institution at the moment. And it means accessioning objects to show a wider range of perspectives, and also, as others have been saying, community perspectives, because ultimately museums they're defined by their audience, right? If there's no one going into the museum, there's no museum. So museums have to prioritize their audience and their communities around them. And I think that's a really important thing to think about in accessioning, and like what objects should be accessioned and which ones should be de-accessioned.
We have some great questions for the folks from the Tang about kind of cataloging identity and how to accommodate for kind of more fluidity of identity. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how you've been thinking about, identifying different labels and how those can change over time?
Sure. I think in thinking about this idea and conversations that we've had, I think the idea works best on like a behind the scenes kind of view first. So not necessarily presenting this information to the public up front right when receiving that information. But as for the fluidity of those identities, I think in some sample surveys that we've been able to view, it's really interesting the way that those identities are categorized, whether or not they're boxes you check off or fill in the blanks, whether or not there's an email or some person to contact, whether that changes or not, like thinking about how these things live. Do they live like by mail? Do they get sent to people and never returned? Are they on the internet? Are they able to be updated on a day-to-day basis? I think like questions like that are things that we've been thinking a lot about. And from like my own personal view, I think like that application of having something, existing that is able to be updated, on that day-to-day basis is important. It's something that curators and museum staff could look at in informing, exhibitions and informing the way that we catalog and represent those identities too. So I think leaving that room for the fluidity is incredibly important, because like data and data markers are inherently restrictive. And that's the problem. That's exactly the problem why we don't categorize those things in the first place. So it's creating a system that allows for that fluidity, that prioritizes the multiplicity of identities beyond a binary, that I think really allows us the opportunity to prioritize those voices, to prioritize identity, because, there's also, shows might not be curated, on those identities explicitly, but it is important to understand those when, placing someone's work into an exhibition or an idea.
Yes, I completely agree. I think something also to note is that in the past, I feel like museums were not really places that understood the importance of fluidity. And moving forward, I think that it's important to just try certain things, like just trying to gather identities, and through the kind of forms that Evan was talking about, and knowing that we might make mistakes along the way, and that the process, since we haven't even started the process, we don't really know what it would look like. And even once we do start making these forms, or like in theory, that there's definitely going to be mistakes along the way, but at least we have to try or else it won't get better.
All right, this question's kind of a fun one for everyone, but what is your museum crush or like art space crush? Is there anyone that you're like, wow, they're doing this thing well, they're showing off the art well, people are having fun in the museum?
Okay, my answer is very biased because I am from Milwaukee and I participated in a like youth program at the Milwaukee Art Museum, but specifically the Milwaukee Art Museum's like educational youth department. They're putting on teen nights. They're having teens sell their art, and actually I'm wearing a shirt where I have a patch that I bought from one of those teens. And for me, it's just been really cool to stay connected with them and watch how much they're uplifting really young voices. And as much as like the Milwaukee Art Museum's huge and change is happening slow, it's really amazing to see it happen and like watch young people be able to be a conversation and be a part of the conversation and be taken seriously. And so it's like definitely one of my big things. And also it's just like home values of I grew up watching the wings open on weekends and stuff. So that's my little museum crush.
I think Harvard has done their social media really well for their art group, for their undergrad student art group specifically. And I think that's something I admire, not just like, oh, because they get more likes, but it's like there's a lot of heavy community engagement that I think I would hope to see from like Williams, for example.
I am also really biased. I'm gonna have to say the Tang. I just love the Tang so much. I feel like a lot of the things that people were talking about, I was like, oh, like the Tang has that, like a space where people can just hang out. Like we have multiple spaces like that. And then also a few weeks ago, I'm in a tap dancing club at my school and we performed inside of the museum. And we also have a really cool student art loan program, which actually we had gotten the idea from Williams College. So, and that's really great. And I feel like there's always just really, really cool and engaging programming, and students really love the museum. And I feel like everyone just has such a good time there, and I love it so much.
Have to say Williams. I work in collections and think a lot about collections, and the Williams collection exploration site I think is really amazing, and a really special thing for a college art museum to have that open of access to all of the information is really incredible.
Yay, we're interacting with our crushes. Awesome. It's interesting to hear about digital accessibility and thinking about ways that we've been engaging with folks, even though maybe our museums have closed this year, especially with COVID-19. What are ways that you've found have been really, really impactful and really nice ways to interact with folks, with students, with visitors, now that things have been shut down or things have been mostly virtual? I know we have a few questions about that. I know with Wham, we've been exploring TikTok a little bit.
Yeah, well, I was actually, sorry, you can go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Mine wasn't too big.
Well, I was just going to say something we did towards the beginning of the year is we kind of engaged with like the public art on campus. So we created like, you know, virtual tours for an app so people can kind of, you know, take their own time and look at public art, you know, on their own. And I think that's kind of, it's one way that we brought in, you know, the entire campus community into our museum, and also a way that we were able to interact with people during this time.
Yeah, I was just gonna talk about that as well. I think something that's been really cool at WAM is the fact that like we've been able to experiment because at this point, any shot in the dark is gonna land somewhere. People interact with digital media in different ways, and TikTok has been a really fun part of that. I'm gonna go ahead and shout out Amy's TikTok on our account. It's really lovely, and I watched it again recently. It makes me really happy. as well as this isn't the WAM Collective specifically, but the Weisman has another group of students working on social media. And then one more thing is actually our Wham shop's Instagram. And now that we sell online, I think it's really stepped its game up, and it's like beautiful. And it's someone else in one of the other groups pointed this out, but as much as like it's not all about likes, it's really cool to see that interaction happening. And everyone does that on different social medias. I feel like I'm clueless when it comes to social media, so seeing everyone do that has been really cool.
Yeah, we, at the beginning of the pandemic, we started a Instagram live show, which basically happens like every single Thursday. I think we've only missed a few in the past year. So we're gonna be taking a break soon because it's so much work to plan, but it's been so exciting to see how it's progressed within the past year. And we always have such interesting programming. Someone performed opera the other week. Students will do curators tours of the Hyde cabinet, which I was talking about before. And there have been some art making ones. And I feel like there's just a huge range of things that you can do over Instagram Live. And it's been really cool to see the interaction and engagement with the public through that.
Awesome. There was a question about kind of digitizing the collection, and I think related to that last question as well. Do you feel like because the experience of viewing things virtually is so different and kind of takes away, the spatial aspect, experiencing the artwork in person, do you feel that there's any competition there between, a digital collection versus a physical collection? Yeah.
I think that the digital collection is a tool for accessing the real collection. So really the digital version of things is it's a really important component of the physical collection itself. I don't think that there's ever going to be a time where it fully replaces the art object, but I think that right now, given the capacity we have with technology, it's something that is underutilized and should be better utilized for accessing the physical collection, making those links digitally, and then having our collection staff being available to walk students into the collection spaces and show us those pieces in person. I think that its capacity as a tool is its use, not a replacement.
I would second that and say I think digitizing has actually made a lot more, as a tool, accessible, because if we want to see something in person at WICMA, it probably had to go through a curator. It probably then had to pass all these things and happen to be in the plan. And I think with digitizing, I found out that we had so many pieces in our collection we couldn't physically store. And I think that's something to just think about in terms of how to expand reach and engage more.
I totally agree, especially for, instructors and folks coming into the museum. It's great to be able to plan out your visit, to see what's going to be there, or to see what else is in the collection too. Yeah, I think it's a great tool. All right, here's kind of a related question to the digital art world, but what do you all think about NFTs and kind of the future of art?
Evil, terrible for the environment, waste of energy, hyper capitalism. I feel like I'm living in the simulacrum, so far removed from anything real at all. So that's my stance.
I would disagree with Caitlin. I know, sorry, I love you tons, but I don't think it's going to be stopped. So I think we should instead take advantage of it as, this avant-garde movement to just think about how to engage with someone very differently. Yeah, it is built on capitalism at its very essence, but I mean, we can argue a lot of things that have now since been transformed into vehicles for access of art. That's how I would view it.
Yeah, I actually heard an interview with Beeple, and he thinks, it's going to be a bubble. I'm hoping it's going to be a bubble and that it's just like one of these expressions of late stage capitalism that will come to pass. But yeah, because I really think that NFTs are expressive of, the opposite ethos that we want museums to express, which is like a democratic ownership, like, and also like ownership linked to status. And I think that's the fundamental thing that makes NFTs important, is that you have this status object, even if everyone can, reproduce a JPEG, or anyone can see it, but you're the owner. I think that kind of notion of ownership, is individual ownership, is what we as institutions kind of need to destroy. We need to create spaces of like mutual ownership and democratic ownership, instead of that kind of like individualist notion of status and importance.
Interesting. Fueling off of your passion for NFTs, whether good or bad, what do you hate about museums? Is there anything you're like, I totally hate this? Don't talk to me about this. Don't get me started on this.
This depends on the museum, but the silence of the white cube space, the sterilization of it, and I think I combat that by going in and just kind of trying to break at least a few social rules and just be like, I'm going to sit on the floor in front of this piece of art so people get that this is a place where we care about art and we're not just here to look at white walls and have it all be pristine. It makes me incredibly uncomfortable personally, and it kind of scares me in a way, actually. I could go on forever.
Just to confirm, Sage and I have been shushed in museum.
Yeah, and I think that relates to what I hate about museums, which is the sense in a lot of museums that you're kind of being policed, and the way that, like just having security there monitoring your every move. And I think that really does the opposite of what we want museums to do, which is to center the people that visit them. But that, having people policing you while you're there just reinforces the idea that these are important cultural objects and they are the priority and not the visitors. And I think, that's one of those like psychological barriers that people have talked about. Some of the other presentations talk about to entering a museum, is that like, why would you go to a place where you feel like, you're on camera and you're also being watched by people, and you're not, like, people should be what the museum is about, not the objects. And obviously, you don't want objects to be damaged, but I think we need to extend more trust to people, because we're just making spaces unwelcoming right now.
Cool. Well, just one more question to kind of cap things off and end our night nicely. What is one word that you would describe the future of museums as? Like, if you just had one word to use, what would you want it to be?
Trusting. I talked about trusting passion, but I think following just the earlier comments also about trusting your audience, I think that's just all varying levels of trust, I guess.
Let's have each of you answer. I'm really curious. It's kind of a challenge, I know.
I'd say sticky.
I would say colorful in different aspects, like the people there and the walls, and just like in general.
I like that.
I would say variable. I don't want all museums to be the same.
I would say hopeful. I think museums have the power to be inspiring places, especially for post-COVID times.
This is one of the words we used at the end of our slideshow, but porous, just open.
I think maybe the word full, both literally and figuratively.
Is that everyone? I don't want to miss anyone.
I would agree, porous or open. Those are good.
I was gonna say human. I think we need a little bit more humanity. Cool. Well, yay. That was really fun. And it was so great to hear from all of you and to answer everybody's questions. I thought this was a really great conversation and discussion, and wonderful to hear from other student groups too. Hopefully in the future we can do some events like this actually in person and get to meet each other and kind of make connections. But this was so wonderful. And thanks to everyone watching who is joining. As a reminder, the webinar will be recorded and will be on our Weisman Art YouTube channel. And it will also be featured in a written piece on our blog in the near future. And I will share my screen here with some more information. And you will all be sent a survey after this event, and we would really appreciate it if you would fill it out. It helps us design programs and initiatives that better meet your interests and needs. If you complete the survey, you will also be entered to win a $20 gift certificate from the Wham shop, a little incentive for you all. And then if you'd like to support Wham also in our digital programs like this, you'll notice there's also a giving link in the survey email as well. And your donations will keep programming like this strong and also freely accessible. So thank you everyone for joining us, and until next time, that's all we have for this evening. Thank you so much.